The U.S. economy was strong for most of the 1990s, as we can see from this figure outlining levels of unemployment. With a high of 7.5% in 1992, it fell to about 4% by 2000. The stock market also experienced tremendous growth. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was at about 3,000 in 1991, but by 2001 it hovered close to 12,000. The high-tech emphasis and dot-com revolution in California's Silicon Valley and Western Washington seemed to be the wave which would carry the United States into the next millennium. As we can see from this figure, gross domestic product increased steadily throughout the decade as well. While all of these figures show robust growth, there were still many holes in this new economy. As seen with this figure, one of the fastest growing sectors of the economy was the service industry, which included many low-paying, low-skilled jobs in retail stores and fast food restaurants. The job market increasingly called for workers with high levels of skill. People born into poverty often did not have the resources to better their education and obtain those skills. Also, while the jobless rate of African Americans and Hispanics lowered in the 1990s, they remained significantly higher than those rates for whites. Overall, the gap between the poor and wealthy in America grew even wider during the decade. Next, I'd like to talk about the background to and impact of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. For years, Clinton had been surrounded by reports of marital infidelity. Well, after assuming the presidency, Clinton was accused of sexual harassment by Paula Jones. During the investigation into the case, it was learned that the president had carried on an affair with a 21-year-old White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Clinton was subpoenaed. He denied the charges under oath and in public. Only later did he admit to what he called an inappropriate relationship with Lewinsky. In the fall of 1998, Bill Clinton became only the second president in U.S. history to be impeached by the House of Representatives. He was faced with two charges, perjury and obstruction of justice, both of which stemmed from the allegations associated with the Lewinsky scandal. A trial in February of 1999 followed, after which the Senate voted. In the end, there was no two-thirds majority vote to remove Clinton from office, but his public image and political clout had suffered dramatically. Surprisingly, Clinton's approval ratings actually increased during the impeachment crisis. The public didn't condone his behavior, but saw his impeachment as a political attack on what was actually a private, personal matter. Many Democrats asked, what could have been? With the soaring economy, relative peace abroad, it seemed as if missed opportunity would characterize Clinton's years in office. Unfortunately, the deep flaws in his own personal moral character ruined any chance of major reform in Clinton's second term. George W. Bush followed Clinton into the White House. We'll explore the election of 2000 and highlight several aspects of his presidency next. The 2000 presidential election pitted Republican George Bush, the governor of Texas, against Democrat Al Gore, the former senator and current vice president for Clinton. Both were baby boomers, and each had come from powerful families. Bush's grandfather was a senator, and his father had served as president. Gore's father had been a senator from Tennessee. The election proved to be one of the closest in U.S. history, and it was uncertain who had won for several weeks. The day after the election, there was no clear winner in the Electoral College. The vote was very close in several states, but it appeared as if the results of the election would hinge on the key state of Florida. Several problems plagued voters in Florida. First, a confusing ballot in Palm Beach County seemed to lead several Gore voters to vote for Reform Party candidate Pat Buchanan by mistake. Poorly maintained punch card voting machines also led elections officials to throw out ballots in several counties, which included a high proportion of poor and African American voters. Gore sued to obtain a recount of these ballots. On the right, we see an elections official scrutinizing one of these partially punched ballots. When Florida's state Supreme Court allowed the recount to continue, Bush appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The results of their final appeal were announced in a 5-4 decision handed down on December 12th. Bush won the presidency as the Republican appointees generally supported Bush. The next day, Gore conceded. For the first time since the 1800s, one candidate had won the popular vote and the other had won the electoral vote. On the right, we see the electoral map from the 2000 presidential election. Bush had some early successes following his electoral victory in 2000. This was seen with the passage of his education plan entitled No Child Left Behind. This program emphasized standardized testing in public schools. He also succeeded in getting Congress to pass a large tax cut in 2001. Overall, however, critics charged the administration lacked an overall vision for the nation as the economy headed toward recession and budget surpluses disappeared. However, the key event which would define the Bush presidency came with the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon on September 11, 2001, and President Bush's responses to those attacks. Some argued that he found his voice with a bullhorn in his hand as he visited Ground Zero in the days following the attacks. Within just a few days after 9/11, Congress granted President Bush the authority to use all necessary and appropriate force to respond to the attacks. Later, Bush addressed Congress and blamed the attacks on the al-Qaeda terrorist network operating out of Afghanistan headed by Osama bin Laden. On the left, we see President Bush with key members of his national defense team. The group worked together to draft a response to the terrorist attacks. There were a variety of responses undertaken by the White House. First, the Bush administration proposed, and Congress then passed, the USA Patriot Act, which expanded the government's powers to monitor people's lives and fight terrorism. In October of 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan in an attempt to uproot the Taliban regime, which gave refuge to al-Qaeda. Also, after initially opposing its creation, Bush bowed to pressure to create a new cabinet-level office of the Department of Homeland Security. In his 2002 State of the Union address, President Bush labeled Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as the axis of evil in the modern world. He further argued that Saddam Hussein posed a threat to world peace and that Iraq's leader had access to weapons of mass destruction. The United Nations then imposed economic sanctions and called for the return of inspectors, but did not authorize force against Iraq. Following Hussein's resistance to the inspectors, Bush sought and received the authority from the United States Congress to invade Iraq. In March of 2003, more than 100,000 American troops invaded Iraq. The capital of Baghdad fell in April. Later that year, in December, Saddam Hussein was captured by American forces. Although President Bush had previously declared an end to major combat operations in Iraq, conditions worsened in 2004. By September of that year, bombings, kidnappings, and highway explosions occurred on a daily basis, and the American death toll increased as the United States headed toward another presidential election. 2004 saw another close presidential election battle. This time, President Bush ran against Senator John Kerry. Kerry criticized the president's war on terror and accused the administration of misleading the country about conditions in Iraq. In the end, President Bush was re-elected to another term in the White House, however, by a margin of about 51 to 48%. This lecture has highlighted about 25 years of recent American history. There are many things which can be evaluated from this era. Several different presidential administrations have been discussed in this lecture. Each man who occupied the Oval Office left his own mark on the nation. Maybe you would like to evaluate the actions of each of these individuals. Overall, which president do you believe had the most positive impact on the nation during this era? Well, this concludes the final lecture, From Reagan to a New Century. The next few slides will offer hyperlinks for additional information, as well as sources used for writing this lecture. Have a great day.